On October 4th, 1793, Otto Hirsch took an axe handle and used it to bash in the skull of his youngest son, Wilhelm. A tragedy to be sure, but this story is not about poor Wilhelm's death, for few indeed ever realized that the boy was dead in the first place. No, this story is about the strange events that occurred after Otto's moonlit journey to dispose of his body at the abandoned mill near Beaver River on that fateful October evening, and the thing that followed him back. Otto Hirsch was known to Marlow as a particularly nasty man, the sort that would quarrel endlessly with neighbors about the beginnings and endings of property lines, while allowing his own to fall to weed and stone. A boastful, degenerate drinker and occasional thief, yet in possession of the sort of low cunning to avoid punishment. He had cemented himself over a life of 41 years as the town persona non grata. While Otto was the most reviled member of Clan Hirsch, his wife and the brood they sired were no less infamous. Irma Hirsch was a horrid crone of a woman, highly critical of others and outspoken in her dubious religious beliefs. Against all evidence, she posited loudly and often that she was the moral center of Marlow, and would accost her neighbors with that little or no provocation on their perceived failings at piety. So it was that when she began to suffer from fits, many of the wives in town would discuss her health with melodramatic sentiment, as they secretly grinned at one another over their cups of tea. At age 34, Irma would be brought low by a particularly intense fit, and was rendered as an invalid. She could often be seen on the porch of their dilapidated home, tobacco spittle leaking from one corner of her slack lips and staining the side of her threadbare dress brown, or barking incoherently at anything or nothing, as the malaise had robbed her of her ability to articulate words. Otto and Irma had 5 sons together: Ludwig, twins Otto Jr. and Volker, Manfred, known as Blood, and Wilhelm, and 1 daughter, Inga, though Inga died when she was only 4 years old. Young girls did not last long around the Hirsches. The Hirsch boys were known to get up to their matter of mischief, ranging from pranks like placing nails on the schoolmaster's chair to crueler fare, like poisoning neighbors' pets. Many in Marlow, if asked, would agree that it seemed only a matter of time before their reveries would end in death. In this, they were correct, and many times over, though none could have guessed the strange events that would follow the first Hirsch killing. It is difficult to say what caused the greater Hirsch to murder his youngest, but one can imagine the perceived injustices piling high, as is often the case with such low men. Perhaps a visit to the tavern, listening to men with greater accomplishments than his speak of their lives, caused Otto to imbibe 1 tankard too many, or perhaps the many self-inflicted woes of his life became too many and sent him to his conclusion. Perhaps it was Wilhelm himself that so incensed his father. As previously stated, the Hirsch boys were renowned for their wild behavior, but Wilhelm was by most accounts considered to be the white sheep of the family, as it were. At 10 years old, he was small for his age, and could often be seen with his brothers at the scene of one misdeed or another, and yet while his brothers would bray with laughter at whatever mess they had been made, Wilhelm seemed to take no pleasure in the misfortune of others. His pallor was sickly, and often mottled with green and purple bruises, and had a thatch of tangled, lace-red brown hair. He was often filthy, but where these traits in the rest of the family inspired loathing and revulsion, many sympathized with Wilhelm. He had an especially close attachment to his mother, who, even in her diminished state, was seen doting on her youngest. He enjoyed animals. This did not make him popular amongst his brothers, who would bully him incessantly. After rescuing a bag of cats that Otto Jr. had tossed into the river, the older boy beat Wilhelm so savagely that he knocked out 3 of his baby teeth. This is but one of the many cruelties the Hirsch boys visited on their little brother. Perhaps it was his gentle nature that drew Otto to him. Ludwig was nearly a grown man. Otto Jr. and Volker, while not overly large, were possessed of some strength and ferocity that telegraphed the psychosis that would addle the latter in his later life. Blood, despite being only 14, was as large and strong as he was dim-witted. Their father, for all of his bitterness and undeserved arrogance, was at his heart a coward, and would not dare to challenge the sons that could best him physically. Regardless of motive or circumstance, on the morning of October 20th, 1793, Otto found Wilhelm in the barn, playing with a toy that he had made for himself from corn husks. Wilhelm shrunk from his father as he entered. After growling a few scarcely intelligible words at Wilhelm, Otto grabbed what he thought was a switch and began whooping his son. In his drunken state, it took nearly a minute to realize that he had actually grabbed a heavy cedar axe handle and had beaten his son nearly unconscious before regaining himself. Otto looked down at his sobbing son, who had sustained a broken collarbone and several fractured ribs, and felt not shame or revulsion, but fear that his crime would be discovered and he would be punished. Besides, the boy was making far too much noise. And so he lifted his axe handle again and killed Wilhelm with 3 sharp blows to the skull. When it was done, he covered the body with straw and then went inside to sleep off the drink. By the time he awoke hours later, it was dark, and he had decided to take the body into the woods, where he would dispose of it. His plan was to take it to the abandoned mill near Beaver River and drop it into the water, where he hoped the fast current would carry the body away. If the body was discovered, it would be assumed that poor Wilhelm had fallen in and was dashed against the rocks. By the time Otto reached the mill, he was beginning to hope that it was discovered, and he could reap the sympathy the townspeople of Marlow would offer him. But it was there that he discovered the hole. It was dug directly in the center of the structure, a perfect circle that extended downwards into complete darkness. He kicked a rock into it, and did not hear it strike the bottom. After some consideration, Otto decided that he would toss the body into the hole, reasoning that it was the safest course of action. He would say that Wilhelm had left the farm in the morning and simply failed to return. These things happened. And so Otto pushed the body of his youngest son into the black hole, where it tumbled silently down, down, down into the darkness. End of story. Or so it would have been, if a little over a week later Wilhelm had not returned to Marlow. On the crisp afternoon of October 14th, the school children were engaged in a game of hide-and-go-seek at recess. 8-year-old Hildy Bauer had secured herself in the hollow of a tree as her hiding place, and had been still for some time when she heard shambling footsteps and the snapping of twigs. Whatever was approaching her was gibbering nonsense sounds, like a mockingbird puzzling out the pronunciation of a conversation it had overheard. Only this voice was deeper and slobbery, as if it were spoken through a mouthful of mashed peas. What stepped into Hildy's field of vision resembled Wilhelm Hirsch. He was naked and soaking wet, but appeared unperturbed and emotionless, despite chill and the state that he was in. He stopped roughly 20 yards from the hidden girl, where a bout of herky-jerky spasms rippled through his body. His face took on a range of emotions, first sadness, then anger, mania, and ecstasy, before settling on fear. Bizarre choking sounds issued forth from his throat that resolved into sobs, and when Wilhelm resembled every bit of a lost and forlorn child, he began to move again, shivering but not unnaturally, toward the tree-lined schoolhouse. Hildy would be found unconscious in that tree hours later, nearly frozen to death. She would spend the better part of a week in bed, locked in a terrifying fever dream, imagining a naked and fish-bellied Wilhelm Hirsch slithering up her bed like a snake, inching closer and closer to her face, his mouth replaced with that of a lamprey. When he finally reached her face, her fever broke. She never spoke of any of this. The schoolmaster, John Crutch, first saw Wilhelm emerge from the woods at a distance, a white smudge against the browns and reds of the autumn forest. He ran to him and held the boy to his chest as he carried him to the doctor's home, where he was dressed and placed before a fire. Upon questioning the boy, Wilhelm reported that he had lost his way home and had come across an old woman's hut. She fed and cared for him, but after a time it became clear that she intended to use him for, in Wilhelm's words, unchristian delights. He had managed to escape her, and only now was able to make his way back home. This fantastic story was received with skepticism at best, just another tall tale concocted by one of the Hirsch boys. Even Wilhelm's brothers themselves, who, if truth be told, had scarcely noticed their brother's absence, discounted the story. He was given valerian root by the town doctor, several sharp punches by his brothers, and sent back to the family farm. Nobody thought of it further, except, of course, for Otto. One can imagine the shock Otto Hirsch must have felt when his boys entered the house, chastising a sheepish Wilhelm, covered in fresh bruises, for inventing tall tales. One can imagine how surreal it must have been to receive an apology from the son that he had murdered 10 days before. One can imagine how Otto must have felt that first night, sitting awake in the darkness of his farmhouse with a rifle across his knees, knowing that in the very next room a dead boy lay. What Otto did not know was that Wilhelm was not in his room that night. He sat unnaturally still in the darkened corner, just behind his father, watching. Life outside the Hirsch home continued as normal. Wilhelm stuck to his fantastic story of witches and the diabolical, while Marlow continued to disbelieve him. From all outside appearances, Wilhelm appeared as he had been. He could often be seen sitting on the porch with Irma Hirsch, as she muttered in her own unknowable tongue. At times, Wilhelm would nod in agreement at her ruminations. He would also continue to follow his brothers quietly into their capers, though it was during this time that their misdeeds took a decidedly darker turn. On November 30th, Benjamin Whitehouse awoke to a sound in his yard. He armed himself and set out into the darkness, only to find Ludwig, Volker, and Blut Hirsch standing in front of his barn. The farmer leveled his rifle at the trio and demanded to know their business, to which Ludwig replied that Wilhelm was just seeing to the cattle and it was best if he just turned around and went back to his house. Even in the dark, Benjamin could tell that the Hirsches were terrified. Ludwig's face was positively luminous in the moonlight, while Volker paced, running filthy hands through his tangle of hair, again and again. Blut, normally oblivious with an idiot's grin on his huge face, whimpered pathetically at each unnatural sound that came from within the barn, which sounded like several people whispering frantically, with intermittent choking or barking sounds. To his shame, Benjamin did return to the house. He would later describe the event to his wife, Catherine. When asked why he didn't force the boys out, Benjamin replied that the ugly fear that was under Ludwig's words was the only honest thing he'd heard from him, and that honesty spooked him. What he didn't tell his wife was that after returning to the house, he stood in his kitchen for an hour before he could stop shaking. What unnerved him so much was that under the whispers and choking, he heard his grandmother's voice, 40 years in the grave, begging him to enter the barn. The next morning the Hirsches were gone, and there was no sign of anything untoward the barn, but for the next month the cows would yield only blood when milked. At this time, Otto Hirsch's already addled mind began to slip even more dramatically into madness. Due to the family's poverty, he could not afford lamp oil enough to light the house in the evenings, and soon his meager stockpile of lumber was extinguished from the fires Otto burned all night to ward off the darkness. He sent his sons into the woods to fell new trees, but each night fresh wood would be loaded into the hearth, and each night it would fail to catch, or produce nothing more than smoke and shadows. And so Otto was forced to sit awake in the pitch blackness of night, and the autumn nights in the country are long and dark indeed. Unable to sleep, he would listen to the sounds of Wilhelm moving through the house with unnatural ease, agonizing over where the boy was. Otto would hear breathing from one side of the room, then gasp in pain as something tugged on his hair or pinched his flesh. A chuckle would come from the kitchen, and then he'd feel hot, reeking breath or cold hands on his body. He had terrifying notions that he would reach out into the darkness and touch his son's clammy, dead face, or plunge a finger into the shattered ruination of where his skull once stood. 2 months after Wilhelm's return, Irma Hirsch uttered the first words she had spoken in a decade. The family was sitting around their table eating supper. Otto was drinking from his flask of whiskey, and Wilhelm fed his mother apple preserves with a spoon, dabbing at the slop that fell from her slack mouth, when a hitherto unknown flicker of light entered Irma's dull eyes. She looked around the room as if just realizing where she was, and then she gazed over at her favorite son. She screamed, Mein Gott, get it away from me!" She fell from her chair and scrambled across the floor like a crab, screaming in naked animal horror, in a way that, Volker Hirsch would reflect later in life, was similar to the sound a person burning alive would make. Irma Hirsch's last words before her final and greatest fit took her life were, "Why do the angels have your face?" Had Irma known what her son was? Had her useless body acted as a prison as she was forced to sit in the company of a thing that should not have been? What had granted her the ability to finally speak after so many years? These questions cannot be answered. It can only be said that as Wilhelm watched the only member of his family that cared for him in any way scream in mortal terror and die, his expression changed not once. Years after Irma's death, many in Marlow believed that it was her shrieking, sobbing ghost that would appear in the southern fields at dusk. This is not the first bit of folklore to arise from these events. Several children's nursery songs also draw their roots to the Hirsch family's woes, such as the skip rope rhyme, The Pest of Marlow. Pest of Marlow tramping on the roof, one tap, two tap, horn and hoof. Listen not to callers when ye take to bed, lest something arise from it in near your stead. On March 7th, Otto Hirsch's anger finally won out over his cowardice. After bracing himself with whiskey, he set off from the tavern toward the farm, once again with violence in his heart. He arrived and walked immediately to the chopping block, arming himself with an axe. In the fog of drink and rage, he did not realize that it bore the same handle that he'd used to kill his son 5 months earlier. Otto tore through the house, looking for whatever devil had taken his son's face, when he saw from the second-story window Wilhelm, illuminated by cold blue moonlight on the snow, enter the barn. Otto followed. It was 2 days before anyone thought to look for Otto Hirsch in the barn, and when they did, he was in a sorry state. Years later, if asked on the events that unfolded next, the townsfolk of Marlow would simply shake their heads and refer to it as the ugliness of '94, before changing the subject. If one managed to pry, they might hear tell of old Otto Hirsch taking a fall from the loft of his barn and breaking his neck, not 2 months after the death of his wife, leaving the Hirsch boys orphans. A sad tale. What they would not hear was that Otto Hirsch was found, blue and frozen stiff, with his spine shattered into gravel, his head completely twisted round, and his teeth missing. Accusations were immediately thrown at the feet of the roving bands of Shawnee that were known to Marlow, for a similar fate befell Jasper Aldridge the previous fall. Harold Thomas announced that it was common knowledge that human teeth were used in heathen rites, but George Altgeld was quick to question the man's expertise on the matter. The truth was that no Shawnee had been near town since Aldridge's body was recovered. Nevertheless, a posse was formed and it searched the woods looking for someone or anyone to punish for the crime. Not for the sake of justice for Otto Hirsch, for many were quite relieved to see him go, but so that the whole sordid affair could be put behind them. In the unfortunate Wesley Braver, Marlow found its scapegoat. A traveling dentist, he was discovered boarding a room in the nearby town of Prosperity. He was dragged back to Marlow and kept there only long enough for the gallows to be erected, and then was hanged. There is no official record of this hanging, and nobody spoke of it ever again. That was that for the tale of Otto Hirsch. The Hirsch boys stayed in Marlow for only a short time before they departed into the wide world. The line between truth and fable is blurred regarding their exploits. But if only half of the stories are true, then one would be hard-pressed to find a better example of the existence of true evil. These are stories for a different day. But what of Wilhelm? Little is known, save for ghost stories. But one thing is certain. For all of their cruelty and savagery, for all of their stark meanness, not one of the Hirsch boys ever laid a hand on Wilhelm again.